Hello everyone. So I guess we'll start now. Um, Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mehvish Kadri and I'll be the moderator for this breakout room today. And before we begin, I would just like to take a minute and go over some ground rules to ensure that all the presenters and guests have a positive and educational experience. I request anyone who is not presenting to keep their mics and cameras off during the presentations to avoid any background noise or distractions. If you have any question or comments, please type them on the chat and we'll go through them at the end during the Q&A session. Presentations need to stay within the allotted 15-minute time. When the time is up, I'll ask the presenter to wrap up their point so that we can move on to the next presentation. This is to ensure that all our colleagues get a fair amount of time to share their research. Lastly, I would just like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and I recommend everyone to turn on their live captions so that for their own convenience. Thank you. That is it from me now and I will pass it on to our first presentation.
Hello, can you hear us? Can you see the slides? Okay.
We can see your screen.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Pei Wang. I'm now a PhD candidate from Queen's University. I'm so glad to be here to sharing my discussion about supporting the language development of international students in an online higher education context. So I want to give you a little bit of context of my presentation. As we noticed that the number of international students worldwide has been multiplied within the past 10 years. The proportion of international student enrollments have increased more than 10%, representing 57% of the total growth in all programs. With that in mind, the growing number of students, we do face some challenges with this population. Many international students are found facing significant challenges, both academically and socially. So my colleagues and I did a systematic paper draw upon 87 empirical studies, trying to figure out the international students' acculturation experiences and to find out what are the factors that impact their academic success. Among three major themes we find, including academic engagement, academic socialization, and social integration, language proficiency is the most demanding and important factor that influence students' learning experiences. Even though most of the students passed the admission test, they still facing some challenges in terms of comprehending the lecture content, talking with their peers, as well as interact with their instructors. So today's presentation, I want to cover three major components. First, I want to talk about what is language and what portion of language should we consider in terms of supporting international students' acculturation process. The second part, I will talk about where and how we can understand these students' English proficiency level. And third, I will draw upon Vygotsky's social culture theory and propose some supporting strategies. What is language? Language is defined by this definition is a thematic complex system that always bounded with culture, individual variances, nationality, and identity. It is important to note that language changes over time, especially under the current knowledge mobilization context. And the way we use language changes on a daily basis. It doesn't matter if our first language, second language, or multiple languages. Language can be oral, written, or can be in a non-verbal way, such as gestures and facial expressions. According to Commons, language can be divided into two categories. One is social language, the other is academic language. Social language mainly refers to the language we use in daily communications, and the requirement for the social language is less demanding compared to the academic language. Academic language is very richly context-bounded, and the context can be refers to the working settings or the learning context. And this kind of language is much more formal compared to the social language. So in our higher education context, we use academic language is more frequent compared to the social language. And for academic language, this part is differs from day-to-day conversation in terms of qualities, functions, as well as linguistic features at the word, phrase, and discourse levels. Academic language development is not exclusive for international students, but students overall. All the students coming to a higher education discipline learning, and they are learning academic terms and terminologies on a daily basis. So with that in mind, as instructors, whatever subject we are teaching, we can having this opportunity to support students' academic language development in our course teaching process. Even though everyone is learning academic language in general, international students still find significant challenges in terms of their English proficiency level. Before we offer appropriate support, we need to understand who the international students are, in particular for their language proficiency level. All these international students passed the admission English test before they be admitted into the universities. And these tests can be included with TOEFL IBT, IELTS Academic. These two tests have been used widely across the world. The CAL test is in particularly popular in our Canadian higher education context. Now, due to the pandemic, Duolingo English test is a rising star, and many universities starting to use this test to admit international students. So these students came here with a test score, but I realized that many educators don't know this information, and they cannot take advantage of this information to understand these students. Each of the tests have different scoring systems, as we can see on the screen. TOEFL IBT, the total score starts from 61 to 100. IELTS, on the other hand, starts from 4 to 9. What information can we get from these scores, and how we as educators can understand the students through these scores? Actually, each of the tests providing the performance descriptors and help us to understand what do they mean by certain scores. And the descriptors break down into 4 separate skills in relation to speaking, reading, writing, and listening. So I highly recommend the educators to get information from this website before they try to help with these international students. So after we know this international student, now we are ready to offer them support. So today's strategy I propose is based on Vygotsky's social culture theory. Vygotsky regarded learning as the social event that happening between the learners and the environment. In this process, learner play a very important role in this process. Whatever knowledge they are learning, language is believed to be the primary means of the mediation. This information is aligned with what we were talking about for academic language learning. So whatever subject students are learning, they need to use the language in their daily basis, or within the class or outside the class. And this is the best way for us to help these students to develop their language proficiency. And academic language can only acquire within the current context. There isn't any specific training helping this international student to help them to grow and learn. So I highly recommend this through Vygotsky's social culture theory to support students in 2 aspects. One is individual learning, the other is social learning. Individual learning, I refer this as learners to support themselves by researching for all different types of resources. Thanks to the internet, now we have so many open online learning resources available to them to learn. However, the only concern for these students is they cannot find it or they don't know where to find it. If we as educators can have access to these resources and refer to the students, and they would be better prepared before the course learning. And in addition to the online resources, each of the university are having this supporting system available for these international students. And based on my experiences at the university, and each of the universities have individual English supporting services available for us. And they do provide one-on-one consultation to help the students to develop their speaking or writing skills, and they also providing some great resources to the students specific to their needs. So attending workshops can be another great way to help these students to learn and immerse themselves into the language learning environment. At the same time, they can interact with the environment, speakers, and also can learn some new knowledge along the process. So for social learning is what we as educators can do within the class or out of class. So this part, according to Vygotsky's social culture theory, learning happening with the interaction between the learners as well as the environment. So within the process, in our class, in-class discussion is a great place to help these students to develop their language proficiency. And but in reality, many international students face challenges and they feel hesitated to participate within the class discussion. Later on, I'm going to propose some strategies that teachers can consider to facilitate their class participation. In addition to discussion, communication groups can be a way to help students to interact with their peers. And this is much easier to do within the physical learning environment. All the students come to a class on the daily basis regularly, so they are much more easy to reach out to each other and build this community. However, right now, when everything moving towards to online, it's hard for these students to be connected. Under this situation, it's better for us to take advantage of the different technologies or social media or platforms. I highly recommend you to think about the team chat groups, Google Docs, or course discussion page. As long as we as educators take a lead to have this communication channel going within the students, and this will better facilitate international students to emerge within the context to learn knowledge as well as to develop their English proficiency. Group learning project can be another way to facilitate learning as well, and language can be improved within the process. So here I listed some great resources I highly recommend to use as learners as well as educators. And this is not all for them to use. So if we could keep collecting all the resources and having this checklist and refer to the students at the beginning of our course, they can do self-help along the way and to support themselves in terms of language development. Among all the 4 basic language skills, I think most of the international students face challenges specific to academic writing. And they came from a different culture, different languages. The way they use writing or the way they write is completely different from English. So I highly recommend the instructors provide examples of academic writing, or even we could provide the model of thesis statement or a good essay structure. In that way, so these students can get a sense about their expectation in terms of what they need to write in their specific assignment. If we need the students to elaborate on specific terminologies, and we need to make sure the terminology is clarified within the class, so they can feel free to elaborate out of class on the writing piece. And the academic writing would better emphasize the critical analysis skills and give these international students much more freedom to express what they want to say about the certain topic rather than what we as instructors want to hear from students. So, as I mentioned, international students may feel hesitant to participate in class. So, if we teach in a class, we always see that international students are always be silent and they're not very active in terms of class participation. In order to help them to get involved in the class, and as educators, I highly recommend that we make our expectations explicit. Regarding to that, we should wipe assumptions and we should use scaffold to help these students to better understand what we are looking for in terms of the class participation. And the way we use questions should be paid attention to, and the questions should encourage critical thinking and facilitate dialogical nature of learning. And to help these internationals better prepare for the class, we could propose or we could pose questions or notes in advance of the class, so students can go through the questions or notes and get a better sense of what they are going to learn within the class, so they can be well prepared before the lecture. So each of the class may have a specific time for Q&A sessions, and when supporting these international students, they may having difficulties trying to reach out to these instructors, and this issue has been intensified specific within the online context. When I think back last year when I teach the courses online, as if we keep the Q&A sessions very short, it's like the participation is not as much as we expected. So I highly recommend it if we want to get these interactions or get this engagement going, we should give students enough time to respond. So a couple of minutes or 5 to 10 minutes will be good at this stage. So for group discussion, international students may say...
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt. How much slides of yours are left? Because the time
only
is
one. I can stop here. So here are the some strategies.
You can complete it. It's just 15 minutes are up. You
Sorry
can
about
complete
that.
it.
And yes, I'm going to briefly introduce the strategies for group discussion and the problem the international face for hesitate to participate group discussion. They may not be clear of the guidelines or poor intergroup communication challenges in terms of distribution, or they may feel excluded. In relation to these problems, I highly recommend it that the instructor may ask the students to initiate a group by themselves, and they can also give clear instructors, set a time for each of the individual students to help them to express their opinions and talk about the topics. And maybe we can also consider as them to assign specific attendance requirements for the courses. So these are the things I talk about for supporting international student language development within the context. And as I mentioned, academic language is not specific towards international student only, but student overall. With that in mind, as educators, we don't need to set this group of students aside. So when we're planning this, as long as we keep in mind that, we can facilitate this language development going, and that will be fine for us, and we won't regard them as a burden when we planning or doing lesson plans. This is all for my presentation. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to let me know after at the discussion session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Now, the next presenter can start the presentation now. could just turn off your camera video, and Nadine Bekush, if I'm pronouncing it wrong. You are mute, Lance.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought that we were the final presenters actually.
Okay, just a minute.
Yeah. I mean, we can do it
and
now.
I'm sorry. And my mistake. Actually, we don't have the person who is going to present second. So if you could, you can.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go ahead. Okay, everything's projecting properly?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So let me jump in. Okay, so to start off, let's just talk a little bit about the academic moment we're in, so the current period. So as was mentioned, higher education is in a transition period right now. So there's been an acceleration of globalization and internationalization of programs, of institutions, of curricula over the past 20 years. There's also a strong narrative around the economic value of enrollment, right? And as a way to increase earning potential, competitiveness in a global knowledge economy. But the thing to understand is that these transitions are really macro level forces, so they take place at the level of policy and also institutional incentives, right? So institutions want to recruit more higher paying students. And the thing to bear in mind is that instructors themselves actually tend to have pretty, low level of power over these changes, right? They don't really have much input, but also importantly, they tend to be underinformed about the systemic changes that are happening in higher ed. But from the perspective of instructors, these macro level changes are really important because they create question marks at the level of actual interaction with students. So we've talked about things like socialization and language in this conference. There are also questions about expectations. So how does an instructor relate to a student, and vice versa? How does a student relate to an instructor? What's comfortable? There are also questions of, motivation. So if enrollment or a graduation is a pathway to immigration, does that change people's motivation for higher education? And also questions of preparedness. And that's kind of what we're focusing on in this paper. The question is, what do students come in knowing or not knowing? So there's something of an assumption sometimes that students' background knowledge, right, doesn't matter to the process of teaching and learning. That's more an assumption that happens on those macro levels, because on the actual level of interaction with students, of course it matters a lot. It matters in course preparation, it matters in design, it matters in delivery. So the assumption that these issues will just kind of work themselves out is probably doesn't hold water. So one important point that we want to make is that in the classroom, the distinction also between international student and a domestic student who received a large portion of their education abroad, it kind of blurs, right? So we're going to use the term transnational students to refer to both of these groups. So the main research question that we're addressing in this presentation is, what should Canadian instructors know about the academic preparedness of transnational students? And we have sub-questions here. So what curriculum did students follow? What teaching styles were common in their preparations? And what are the implications for Canadian instructors? The methodology that we used was a systematic review of the literature. We focused on 4 key regions, so China, India, the Middle East and North Africa, and Latin America, because these are regions where Canada receives a lot of international students from. And what I'm going to do is just go through briefly the general characteristics of the curricula from these 4 regions here. So one thing to note, for example, about the general education in China is that there was a massive reform which began in the 1990s. It extended to all regions outside of Shanghai because Shanghai had already implemented its own reform. And these reforms were implemented progressively over many years, actually over something like 2 decades. One of the focus points of these reforms was a movement to shift from instructor-centered to student-centered teaching and learning. There's also strong emphasis on 21st century skills. So those are things like problem-solving, collaborative learning, personality elements like perseverance, as well as things like the use of technology, as well as intercultural knowledge. When it comes to understanding the general characteristics of the curriculum, for example, in India, one thing to bear in mind is that this is actually it's very difficult to generalize here. This is a very, very diverse country with numerous religious and linguistic minorities. Another theme to emerge from the literature here is that there are big private and public networks of schools. And there's a very high variability in the quality of schools. It depends on the institution, it depends on the region. There's also the theme of some economic inequality that comes out. And so in regions, for example, that would be more disadvantaged, teaching will often be oriented towards what are called reference disciplines. So those are the disciplines that don't change much, right? Like math, language, and history. And the kind of teaching culture there will be to teach to the exam. And secondary school will be seen as a path to tertiary education, with the hope that tertiary education can help move students into a better socioeconomic position. In the Middle East and North Africa, here again, we're obviously looking at a very large region, and there are large regional differences. Here, one theme to come out of the literature is that there's a history of colonial education systems that have then made way to other forms of political influence. So reforms will often be top-down, very strongly top-down, and teachers and students often are kind of skeptical of them. It leads to some interesting observations. So for example, in many places, in many countries, you might see a curriculum that's very similar to that in the Western world, with a couple of exceptions, so one around religious and moral education. But then also, in the case of the humanities, for example, where you might have a canon of Western literature that's studied, but it's studied out of context, leading to big differences in how these kinds of subjects will be handled. Finally, talking about Latin America as a region. So one of the themes that comes out of the literature here is that there's a high degree of social economic inequality. And that inequality has led to a push to really increase access to secondary education across the board. However, this is in a context where the system must balance this expanded accessibility with the economic realities of many families, which means that children will start working often very young. Because often the infrastructure for higher education might be lacking, this has also led to a lot of economic partnerships with other countries. So there might be a lot of branch universities from other institutions. And now I will hand it over to Saul.
And I'm going to pick up and talk a little bit about some broader issues as a result of this data. And globally, there's this effort going on that we see across all of the different regions that we studied to converge the curricula. Where the convergence is probably the most successful is in the sciences and math. It's less successful in social sciences and humanities, or what we call the culture-dependent disciplines, because one of the purposes of public schooling, especially K through 12 systems, is to replicate the local value system. And so it's not, that particular part is not going to be all that open to internationalization. There's also an implementation gap. There are, in each region where they're implementing curriculum change, the goals are very lofty. The results, unfortunately, have not exactly met what they were hoping to achieve. And the resources that are needed to make these things happen, both the teaching resources and skills, especially, and the technical resources, often are the resources that are available are often below what's needed to make the implementation. Next slide, please. In terms of the reforms in the teaching style, and this is really important for teaching in Canada in particular, the large-scale reforms specifically target teaching style. They're trying to move from teacher-centered approaches and replicating or mimicking the teacher's behavior to student-centered approaches. And so this requires not just simply some acts on the part of the teacher. There's a whole instructional strategy that underlies this. And the goal behind it, of course, is to achieve those 21st century skills where people are independent actors that can deal with flexible situations, adaptable to those changes, and can work with other people. But in this area in particular, there's a huge implementation gap. Part of it is institutional inertia. They just don't feel like it. And part of it's pushback from educators who are going to have to change the way they teach. And the longer you've been in this business, the harder it is to make that change. Next slide, please. So what are the implications for those of us who are teaching in Canada? First of all, when you're dealing with international students, you are not dealing with a monolith. You have students coming from very different educational systems. An international student who is educated in China is not the same as this, doesn't have the same education as someone who was educated in India or the Middle East or Latin America, and so forth. The other thing to remember is just because the student does not pay international fees, they may have been educated in other parts of the world. So they may be a local student for fee-paying purposes, but for curriculum purposes, they are an international student or a transnational student, as we're calling them. So you really need to treat assumptions of similarity with great care. Some things that specifically think about are knowledge bases. What we think students should have as a knowledge base may be very different from what their actual knowledge bases are. So you need to validate those assumptions. And the larger your transnational student base, the less likely the cultural knowledge is shared, because this is one of the realities of the diverse student bodies, is that they have different life experiences. And the larger the transnational part of it is, the less that lived experience is going to be like the Canadian experience. Next slide, please. And the Canadian teaching style may be different and therefore unfamiliar to many of the students, not just the ones who are labeled as international for their fees they paid, but the students who are either permanent residents or citizens of Canada, but got the majority of their education elsewhere. In addition, instructors will need to have a strategy for addressing these areas of potential mismatch. So at the very least, they need to clarify their expectations and maybe even validate the incoming knowledge of the students in certain subjects. In other cases where they're teaching culturally based subjects, they may want to provide some resources to help bridge the gap between where students are and where the instruction is. And so that may be background information that you may not have felt the need to give before. But it may also be just having conversations and bringing people up to speed and finding out what they do and know what they don't know. Next slide. I believe this is actually the last one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the limitations, sorry. We have limitations, suggestions for future research. The limitations, this is a literature on comparative education, not focused on teaching and learning. So we were primarily looking at curriculum, but when we were looking at curriculum, we found that teaching was a part of it. But we're just learning about what people are coming in with. What you do with that has to be adapted to your individual classroom. And next slide. Thank you. So we look forward to discussing this with you. And I want to thank Nadine for all of her words.
Thank you. Okay, let me come back so I can stop my share. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was very informative and interesting presentations over there. So we are open to questions and discussions if anyone has any. They can either turn on their mics and ask the questions or type them on the chat box.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a question to Saul and Nadine, and Peiyu, and I have one for you later. I'd like to ask you, what actual strategies do you suggest then You say we need to clarify expectations, we need to gather background information. What strategies have you used that were successful?
It's an interesting question because this came up, the whole study came up as a result of a needs assessment for another project. And we were trying to find out how teachers felt about their teaching at the college and university level. And one of the things the teachers kept complaining about was that their students didn't know what they were supposed to know. And then the more you learned about their students, you realized these people were just living in different worlds. And so so it's not like there's a simple singular strategy that you can use to get into the other world. But the simplest thing you can say is this is where student-focused teaching as a philosophy and a guiding approach becomes super important. So you may need to do a pretest depending on the subject that you're doing. In a subject like our basic assumption is, and Nadine can clarify if I'm misrepresenting this, the basic assumption that we have is that if you're teaching something in the sciences or natural sciences or applied sciences, there's a good chance that your students have the kind of foundation that you think they have in the subject area. If you're dealing with other subject areas, especially the social sciences and the humanities, and to some extent the fine arts, they probably don't. So then the question is, you have to think about what prior knowledge, and if you have prereqs on your course, that will deal with some of that. But if you don't have prereqs on your course, the other thing is that then you can turn that into a teaching opportunity, not just for your other students, but also for yourself to find out what students actually do know about things. The other thing I think will be interesting, some courses are given around the world, but they're going to be done under a cultural lens. So a simple example would be a Shakespeare course. So people do take Shakespeare and learn about Shakespeare throughout the world. But you're going to learn about Shakespeare through the local cultural lens if you're in Iran or you're in China, you're in India. And so why not find a way to bring that into the classroom? The downside is that students may not have the same interpretation that you have. But the other thing too is that whole experience of Shakespeare is, I mean, even for someone who grew up in a Western culture, I mean, the language is just really, we went with the plot summary the first time we went to see a Shakespeare play. So, I mean, I think, English from the 1600s and the late 1500s is a different language, even from those of us that live here. And by the way, the English that they speak in Australia is slightly different than the English that we speak in Canada, which is different than the English that's spoken in the US and the UK. So I think it's really just a kind of a call to reduce your cultural assumptions and be clearer and more explicit about what you're thinking and feeling. And that, of course, leads to greater clarity. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Nadine, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, one thing that has kind of struck me while we were looking at this literature is that since also increasingly the students in higher education really come from lots of different backgrounds, but not only in terms of their national background, but in terms of their professional background, in terms of their educational background. I mean, this is true in domestic students as well. That it's an interesting thing to think about, to look into. In some universities, I'm thinking particularly like City University of New York, one way that they tried to get around the big differences that students would come in with in terms of their preparation was to require everybody to either take a first semester, which is just math and language, or test out of it. And so you test out of it, and if you don't pass it, that's all you do your first semester is math and language. And I thought that was also an interesting approach in those cases where those kinds of prerequisites would be absolutely necessary.
Thank you. I'll let someone ask a question, and if they don't, then I have something else.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have any question or something to discuss related to the presentations?
Can I just jump in, if that's all right?
Yeah.
Oh, I just have a quick question for Pei. Sorry, I was in another meeting, so I didn't get to listen to all of your presentations. But I find your topic is very interesting. So I'm just wondering that if you could be briefly talk a little bit about like the effective practices to support the language development of the international students, as I assume that they may encounter more difficulties, especially during online medium. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And I would like to elaborate what I said before and do a brief summary. And I think my topics today will mainly focus on how we support international student language development in higher education, online higher education context. But most of the strategies I recommend today can cover physical or face-to-face learning context as well as online context. And what I mentioned today is the strategy I recommended is helping the students to learn language within the context. And for higher education, they don't have the opportunity to go to the specific training program to improve their language proficiency. However, within the context, different discipline learning, they still have chances to learn and develop their language proficiency. So this mainly through the interaction with different resources within the instructors as well as students themselves. So the strategy I recommended is help them to find appropriate resources, either online resources or the supporting services within university. And we could also facilitate the interaction within the class. For instance, what we can do to facilitate the in-class discussion and help these students to participate more within a class. And I also recommended to facilitate the communication channel among students so they can share the resources, they can communicate together in terms of learning academic language, because like learning academic language is not specific towards this international student, but students overall, everyone in the class learning different terminologies or academic terms on daily basis. So this learning can be applied to everyone in the class. So yes, that's all. I think that covers most of what I said today. And if you're interested, you can look at my PowerPoints to see specific strategies I proposed. And I can leave you my contact information. You can reach out to me and have a conversation in regards to that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's great.
Are there any more questions?
Well, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind asking one for Peiyu.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Peiyu, you talked about individual strategies and you talked about the social strategies. And in your opinion as a researcher, do you think the individual or the social are more important?
I think they're both important. And the thing is, I think the many of the instructors in higher education, they cannot focus on the language piece, and they have their subject teaching responsibilities. They cannot pay too much time towards this language training. That's why individual learning comes to play an important role within the process. However, we need to provide them appropriate supporting services and referring to them to the appropriate place to reach for help. As I mentioned in the presentation, every university have the supporting services to support these students' English development, and this is the place for them to reach for help. But many of the educators in higher education context, they don't know much about these services available to them. So there's kind of a gap between the services there, but students' lack of information, where to find it or how to reach for help. So that's why I recommend both individual learning and social learning happening at the same time.
I have a question about that actually, because so for example, if the universities should, be implementing some support for students learning discipline-specific language, is that support services, or is it, for example, department seminars that are, maybe low credit, where you have to attend to at least listen to it, and maybe you get extra credit if you participate in, sometimes I wonder if there's, another way in that would also allow students, for example, who are not comfortable participating to prepare. So prepare questions, work on something beforehand, right? So what are your thoughts about that?
I think that's a really great way to help them to participate, of course. And as I mentioned, many international students, they are very shy and they came to a new environment they're not familiar with. They cannot go outside to the world. They just stick with themselves, even though they're social with the peers who are from domestic cultures. So make it as mandatory credit will help them to go outside and interact with the cultures a bit more, as well as the academic environment. Yes, I like that.
That was great discussions. And does anyone else have any questions or want to discuss anything?
I have another question.
Sure.
So one of the things that it kind of is motivated us to look at what we looked at is also just the instructor experience, right? And instructors seem to be, to some degree, struggling. So especially if you're looking at higher education instructors, it's a kind of a long road to the PhD. People are often kind of tired by the time they get there. They get a job, a teaching job. It's not necessarily a very secure job. What kind of training, what's appropriate? You know what I mean? So we know that there's more need. There's often calls for instructors to do more rather than less, right? But what's realistic in the sense that what can people do? What should be done in the classroom versus what is a support service thing versus what is a department thing? That's broadly speaking, that's my question.
So I think you have a very tough question. So it's hard. That's a potential issues across the institution worldwide. And if I would suggest, I would recommend more training for these instructors, and especially for those. I know finding a appropriate job in Canada is kind of difficult sometimes, but once they get into the job, sometimes they cannot take care of everything. But once they get into the kind of ritual, the ritual they like, they kind of stay within the comfort zone all the time. So professional support comes very important in this process. So I would recommend that.
I actually have some thoughts on that one, Nadine.
Yes.
Different jurisdictions have actually started requiring that university and higher education faculty, not just university, also college, get a teaching credential in addition to their expertise credential. That lasted, I think, for about a year or two in the UK, and as soon as they put it on, they took it off. And I think part of the problem is that during the tenure process, in the early tenure process, the focus is so much on the research that the teaching is a secondary issue, and we almost pawn off all the teaching responsibility on support staff. I mean, the teaching support issues. And we also don't even ask the faculty to have great understanding. We'll send them a memo that we hope that they might actually look at. I think probably, and the other thing too is that, to be realistic, my experience has been that teaching, unless it's abysmal, I mean, and I mean really, like we're talking bottom 10% abysmal. It doesn't really factor in much in a tenure decision. It's almost exclusively based on the research. So, which becomes a problem on a number of different levels. It's a problem at the very least on a moral contract that the public has with the universities, because as much as we try to explain that we're about research and we hype it in all of our PR, the reality is that what people experience in a university, the general public, will be either be as students or as alums, and it's always related to the teaching. And very few actually get involved in the research. It's also, and my personal feeling is that during the tenure process, I think we need to take teaching more seriously, but then we have to, if we're going to make if we're going to make the stakes higher, then we also have to put teachers through a training program. And it's interesting, and I'm going to just share some of the stuff that Nadine has uncovered in her own dissertation research, which is looking at the supervision. And when it's in the end, this is a no-brainer conclusion, but it's just mind-boggling how it's not common sense among many faculty that students whose supervisors tell them what they expect of them and are explicit with them tended to have a much better outcomes than those who have faculty supervisors who expect students to learn by osmosis and just guess what they want. And I don't know any other way of putting it, because I mean, I think unless you put it in such simple, blunt terms, I think everyone, because you also I heard recently a faculty member decrying the fact that her students were not at the level she wanted to teach them at the PhD level. And I think that's like really twisted thinking on a number of different levels. And we never tell faculty, you start with your students where they are, not where you wish they would be. It's kind of like parenting. We know that when parents want their kids to be the kind of person they want them to be, it usually means a lot of trouble. It's great because it makes for drama on television and stage and film. It does not make for anybody to be very, very happy, and it doesn't get the kid anywhere near where the parent wants them to be, or more importantly, where the kid wants to be. And I think we have to take our students at the same place. Where are they, and how do we get them where they want to go? And especially as we get further in that journey, it's more about, we're supposed to be tailoring that journey. So that's why, and I don't think anyone is instinctively prepared to do that. That's why I think some kind of intervention, and I'm using the word training because that's my background, training and development. Someone has another option, that's great. But I think it's something where you can't rely on sending memos out and making things voluntarily available. I do think you need, well, there have been really super important things in the university, like avoiding sexual misconduct. We have required it by law, at least in my province. And I think that if we expect good teaching, and we've always treated it as a second-class assignment, until we start putting a little bit of teeth into that assignment and say, it may not be the primary thing, but it's still a major part of your evaluation, but we're going to support you in making that really, good. I think we're always going to have a problem.